workforce era. I am Melissa Martin. I am your guest host for the Tech Ed podcast, and with me is Bernie Lynch, who is the CEO of Factory Unlocked. Bernie, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Melissa.
Awesome, and Bernie's doing some really exciting stuff on startups, on training, on workforce development, credentialing, all sorts of exciting things that you're into, and we're going to get into all of that during our time together. Bernie, just tell us, what is Factory Unlocked?
So Factory Unlocked is an organization that is dedicated to scaling hardware startups primarily, and we do that through a multitude of ways.
Sure.
Everything from go-to-market strategies for startups, which then leads into what are all the things that startups need to do to both go to the market and scale.
Yeah, and what's your background that brought you into being an expert in this area?
The work I'd been doing in commercializing startups really led me to understand that I was working with many Carnegie Mellon University startups. And we did a project where every time we were scaling them, they were all going off to China to make their products. And between 2008, 9, 10, particularly, there was a lot of defense budget cuts, which was leading to a lot of the companies that in the past had received defense funding to develop their technology. Because that funding had gone away and they went to kind of a commercialized market. What I was witnessing was a lot of IP and technology all going to China. So because of that, I discussed with the folks at CMU that I worked with that this was a problem I felt and that we needed to solve it. So we designed a project and really hit the halls of DC talking about how we thought this was a problem, that we needed to develop startup manufacturing and production as a initiative in the U.S. And we received some funding to do that. So we did a project from 2012 through 15 to take 25 CMU Carnegie Mellon University startups and teach them how to make their products in the U.S. And to do that by teaching people how to be the first, second, and third hire in prototyping, design, and small batch production for startups. So that became the Maker Professional Program, and that's really how I got my start into workforce and figuring out, how do we do that?
So, and that's really interesting because certainly, like, there's a lot of conversation going on now about manufacturing coming back to the U.S. and how do we keep labor here. And on the other end of things, there are more startups happening than ever before, and it's in people in the emerging technologies. And you've been doing this for a long time, so you've been in the space for a long time and helping these startups. And so I think that's really incredible because you were there long before it became as popular as it is now. What are some of the, you said prototyping and modeling, and what are some of the technologies that you're using for this?
Technologies, well, so you're talking about kind of the
physical tech. I mean, are you doing 3D printing? Are you doing machining?
Sure. I mean, it's, the original design that we did was, could we do this in a maker space? Kind of agile, rapid prototyping technologies. And even back when we were doing this, Tech Shop came to Pittsburgh. We were going to actually create a maker space, and we were lucky that Tech Shop came to Pittsburgh right at the point of our project.
Oh, nice.
So we had an office inside Tech Shop Pittsburgh.
Great.
And we ran our program from there. But our training director the very first day said to me, "This isn't going to work." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "The startups need space so that they can make their products and not move their products." So that's actually part of what Factory Unlocked did, was create a 33,000 square foot space for hardware startups that were capitalized, so not hobbyist makers.
Right.
Which in a lot of ways, that's who we worked with Tech Shop, and a lot of the folks we trained to go work with startups ended up with side gigs and became, makers, and that's what Maker Professional was about. How do we teach people how to make products in a professional way? But sure, we taught digital tooling. I remember teaching 3D printing at that time. And my training director, an old hardline manufacturer said, nobody's ever going to use this technology.
Well, we know how that worked out.
And I said to him, I promise you, very shortly, someone will. And sure enough, a startup called Bossa Nova called and said, we need a 3D printing tech. And I turned to my training director and said, told you. So we sent 3 candidates over, and they hired 2 of them. So it's exactly the kind of, how do you look ahead at what's coming, and how do you train for the future, and which is where startups are.
Yeah.
So startups aren't old hardline manufacturers who aren't adopting it. The startups are the ones truly adopting digital technology and things like additive much earlier.
Yeah, if you're looking, additive has been around for a long, long time, but as you look at it's an exponential adoption in recent years, but if you're talking 8-10 years ago, it was still like, no one's ever going to use that, just to your point, and now it's so far beyond prototyping or tooling or fixturing. It's now figuring out, let's see how we can do additive and 3D printing for production, for scale, and it's becoming possible. The technology is getting there, the use case is getting there, the financial model is getting there, but you were again on the front end of all of that while it was happening. So
well, you could see the future. You could see where it was heading, and especially when you work with startups, you're making products that don't exist. So you have to be able to not only iterate in the prototype phase, but you have to be agile, the old fail fast early.
Yes.
And inexpensively.
Yes.
So a lot of the work we did and a lot of the training we did was actually teaching design thinking and prototyping with that mindset, which is how could you get there faster, less expensively, and certainly 3D printing and additive was one of the methods that could get you there the fastest. Right,
and I think if you now look at the makerspace model in general, the Fab Lab model that's now in education everywhere, those mindsets, that's what they're teaching is fail fast. What are the best ways to get there? How do we prototype? And then just that creative out of the box thinking for creating new things. Yes. Absolutely. So tell me, do you have any really interesting stories or startups that that were part of this project that you want to share?
I think there were with the 25 startups that we worked with. There were a lot of really incredible stories that came from here. One of my favorite was when we would interview the startups on what were the skills that they needed. And I remember one in particular who had a technology that they needed to iterate, and they needed somebody to run the machinery. But they said, but we also need somebody who, all of our receipts are still in a shoebox. And so, so I said, so what you need is a fabricator, machinist, prototyper who can do finance.
Right.
And believe it or not, we had a student with that qualification. They had a finance degree, but really loved making products. So we put that student with them, and he worked with them for about 2 years. And I remember he turned to me one day, and he had also had a history in manufacturing, but he turned to me one day and said, I am never going back to the factory floor. This is a blast. And so, that was kind of our first hire out of the program, directly with the startup that was, they were doing a project that ultimately, the Army adopted. And it was a project that went to the White House, the very first White House Maker Faire, that we were a part of as well. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
And when was that?
That would have been in, I'm guessing, 2014, the Obama administration made our project a national initiative. And his 2014 State of the Union speech said, we're going to make sure the products of the future of our startups are made right here, which was the name of our project. But it's because we had done a White House briefing, a workshop for in October of 13. Really teaching all the federal agencies how you can use this mechanism of startup manufacturing and production in maker spaces, and how that can be a first step. So a lot of the federal agencies following that, we worked with them on investment. For example, we did a congressional briefing with we worked a lot with commerce,
Yeah.
and they did investments with every MEP
Yeah.
in the U.S. then was capable of getting 100,000 toward working with startups.
Wonderful.
So those were the kind of things that we were trying to change, really the face of U.S. investment into caring about startup domestic manufacturing and production. And I would say that every federal agency started changing their investment strategies to support that. And it was really the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Innovation, Tom Khalil. He was the one who heard what we were doing and really helped scale it nationally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was 8 years ago, and now the amount of funding that the federal government is putting into manufacturing in general, into training, into entrepreneurship and startups, we've never seen anything like it.
Yes.
It's incredible.
Yes.
You've mentioned a couple of times the word training and how that, it plays a pivotal role, especially when you're looking at startups, new technologies, new spaces that people are in. How do we prepare people to be able to manufacture these products? How do we prepare people to have the skills to work in these environments? And so I guess as you were working with these startups, tell me about how, there were training gaps and what you saw on the training side and the skill development side.
Yeah, I think when you're inventing a new product, so a lot of the companies we worked with were autonomous robotic firms.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we realized was not only had nobody ever made the product before, but nobody knew how to operate it, maintain it, install it.
Yeah.
So as a result, we worked with, out of the 25 companies we worked with, several of them did scale to the hundreds.
Okay.
And so we were working with literally from the first hire, who was outside of the founders, all the way up to working with companies on developing not only the pathways for hire, but the competency, kind of the occupational competencies, the pathway inside a company where they would get hired, what they would learn. So that's how I actually got into workforce and training. It was, as I say, foisted upon me. If you're trying to scale a startup and you've just invented a new widget and nobody knows how to make it, operate it, maintain it.
Yeah.
So those were some of the things that we did working with startups was helping them map pathways for hire inside the company, in addition to what were the required skills, and then what would be the actual occupations, and how do you go from a 3-person company to a 300-person company? So
those are big questions, and a lot of good work you did to help address those challenges with those startups. And one of the things that we were just talking with the Jim Wall, who's the executive director of SACA Smart Automation Certification Alliance, and what he was saying and what we've seen is, yes, there's a lot of emerging technologies, and every company has its own unique set of technologies and very unique set of skills, but maybe that's a top 10 or 20%. But there are a set of standard foundational skills that individuals in manufacturing need that can be applied across the board, and then you have those additional, other skills that are unique within that own organization. And so I think that was some of the things you noticed on the automation and robotics side, and that led you to some partnerships with Rockwell and FANUC. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I met Paul Aiello at FANUC. I had actually been working on a project with the Department of Defense and Caterpillar on folks leaving the Navy.
Okay.
And Caterpillar said, we really want everybody to learn how to run FANUC robots.
Okay.
And so I had called Paul Aiello in terms of, I was led to Paul Aiello, and it was like meeting your soul sister. I'm sure he'd appreciate that.
We'll make sure to tell him you said that.
Because
great.
We were just on the same page about, and what I really appreciated about what FANUC had been doing, back at the Carnegie Mellon Ranch and at Factory Unlocked, and one of our startups was using a FANUC robot to harvest cherry tomatoes.
Okay, wow.
And I also knew of many of the roboticists in Pittsburgh who were teaching robots to fly planes, to do kind of a whole series of things.
Sure.
So I think the application of how do you now program a FANUC robot,
Yeah.
not necessarily just inside industry, but what were the applications that are going to be the future of
Right.
an automated society? What can robots do?
Right.
So I do think that Paul and I started talking about some of these applications and what the similarities were in training an autonomous robotic skill set and what we were teaching people on, believe it or not, how to operate a robot and how to maintain one.
Yeah.
Those all became things that connected to the training that FANUC was doing.
Yeah.
And I had met Paul at the time that FANUC and Rockwell were coming together really and going to market with their connected smart manufacturing system,
Right.
which is pretty phenomenal as
really
a
is.
training tool.
Yes.
So I ended up working with them more on what were the strategies of the application of the occupations
Sure.
for that training. And what I thought was pretty phenomenal was that it goes the entire range from operator to technician to integrator specialist.
Yes.
You can literally do a multitude of training on it, from programming to you name it.
Yeah.
So it covers the range of skills. And so I saw that as how it related to even the autonomous training in robotics and how the skill sets were completely aligned. Other than, is it a mobility platform, and what is the environment it's in?
Right.
But those are all the same questions you would ask of any piece of robotic equipment as well.
Right. And so you've been working pretty closely with, you're a great collaborator. You bring together people from industry, from education. You kind of got, and you love bringing people together to have these, how can we share best practices? How can we collaborate? How can we learn from each other? And so tell me about kind of the value of collaboration and bringing in these different stakeholders to, like you said, prepare people for what's coming.
Most of my career, I owned my own business, and I was kind of a serial entrepreneur. And a lot of the work I did was in collaboration. But I think what was most life-altering was the mayor of Pittsburgh asked me in 2006 to come work for him.
Wow.
Yeah. And
wonderful.
And the city was bankrupt. And his, we had a mayor who had been in office for 12 years.
Okay.
City was not in great shape. And, he finally got me when he said, let's go lift all boats. Let's figure out without taxes or punitive measures how we can kind of revenue develop for the city.
Right.
So hour after hour in my first 6 months was spent every hour listening to people who would come in and they either had a problem or a solution.
Okay.
And what started forming for me was this notion of we listen every day to problems and solutions, but what isn't often done is how do you connect if you have 60 problems and 60 solutions, how do you tie them together, or what is the single solution that solves 60 or 30 at one time?
Right.
So it really informed, unfortunately, that mayor died in office within 9 months. And so I stuck around for another 6 months and, launched things like the Pittsburgh Promise and a few other initiatives that we had hoped to lift all boats.
Sure, yeah.
But I do think that what it taught me was if you have problems that are common and shared and manyfold, how do you, in a single initiative, solve many problems in one initiative?
Right.
And that really informed the work that I did after. And I would also say the University of Pittsburgh, I had a weekly meeting with many of the universities, and gentleman from the University of Pittsburgh said, we should just hire you to keep pulling us together the way you've been doing this.
Yeah.
And that really was informative to me. And that's actually what I've been doing is, how do you look at some of the largest problems that we face in society.
Yeah.
And then how do you pull people together to solve them? And I think the freedom I have to do this is to be able to say, I don't know how to solve this, but let's work on it and let's try and figure it out.
And find someone who does.
Yes, yes. Instead of sitting there saying, I know everything, so follow me.
Yeah.
It's more a matter of if this were solved, somebody would have done it. So it's not solved. So let's just, whatever we do is better than what we have right now. So much of the work I do is exactly that position, which is we have a challenge, we have a problem. I mean, I think the one facing us in society now is we're moving into an automated world.
Yeah.
It will be it's not just the Internet of Things, it's the automation of everything.
Yes.
And we have a society and a populace who isn't ready for it. I liken it to it's 1990 and the Internet is here.
Yeah.
And now what?
Yeah.
And the belief then was, well, if you have a business, you need a website, and that'll be the only time you ever need to use the Internet. I know. And it was laughable then.
Right.
But it's the same laughable now,
Yes.
which is you have this situation where we're on the threshold of widespread automated society,
Yeah.
and we are not preparing. And the work I do with a lot of education organizations, universities, community colleges, high schools, is how do we connect them together into the concept of we have to go together. We have to pathway this. We have to connect. You cannot take 3 years anymore to develop a curriculum that somebody thinks is what needs to be taught.
Yeah.
And I think what's most challenging about automation, if we used to make things with our hands and then somebody picked up a hammer one day and then there became analog technology and then digital and now it's all automated technology. I think the challenge for all of education and training is where does that begin and end? Do I start with my hands and the hammer, or do I just jump in at automation? And I think that's where there's so much more knowledge base to learn, both historically but where we are today.
Right.
And I do think it's what I see out in the field but we are on a precipice of something that's just going to go so much faster and an exponential.
Yes.
And so to me, it's really critical to get universities and colleges aligned with where industry is and the pace of industry and how much this is just going to explode in the next decade.
Yeah.
And for them to stay aligned with industry and keep pace.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's been something that we've heard time and again in the last 2 days, in the last few months. Everybody we talk to on the podcast is the same thing. The speed at which, technology is being developed, the speed at which industry is able to move, and then, unfortunately, the gap with the speed at which education is able to, with all the constraints that educators face in changing their curriculum and getting new programs approved, it's bogged down, and educators are stretched thin, so we need to find more creative solutions, and that might be finding somebody who has created the solution so we can rapidly implement maybe something that's being done in New York over in California if it's been a proven plan and it works. And I would add to that too that sometimes we have right now education is a little bit competitive because we know that enrollment rates are tricky, especially at the university level, and so colleges are competing for students, and that's difficult for them, so they want to have that competitive edge, and so sharing information is a little bit tricky. And then you have manufacturers and employers, and for them IP and their secret sauce, they want to hold that so close to the vest because that's what differentiates them. But at the same time, if we don't solve these workforce issues, the U.S. as a whole is going to lose any competitive edge that we might have had. So we have to be willing to let go of some of that and work together. I would ask, from what you're seeing in the conversations you're having, what are some of the biggest skill areas that we see a gap for students or workers in this automated world that we need to address right away?
I just want to comment on what you just said.
Yeah.
I have a monthly call with universities to work together.
Yeah.
It's across the U.S.
Yeah.
And in fact, right before here, I just made sure that 2 of them met each other.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Because they're not currently, one of them's not on the call, and we talked about the competitiveness of it.
Yeah.
And my appeal to them is the competitive model for education, just has to, we need to go together.
Yes.
There's competition, but what we're not doing is we're not meeting the needs, the skill needs, right, of what's occurring in society right now.
Yeah.
So the universities really, I understand, and have worked with some of the most competitive universities out there. And I understand the competitive nature of, who's big, who has the big reputation, who's small and has, reputation. But I think at the end of the day, the skill gap in the learning, and what I keep seeing occur is engineers are coming out of engineering schools programs without the automated technical knowledge that they need for the automated society. And I think engineering programs are starting to develop automation engineering more so. But I would also, on the state of Utah's here, I've been working with them, and they're doing a state standard for robotics and automation for the schools, and working with the top universities in Utah, as well as the career and tech schools, and ideally to the high school. But they've developed a pathway model. And what we talk about is, even if you have enough engineers, there is a ratio of, you still need 7 technicians, and you need 20 operators. So for every 1 engineer that everybody's so focused on, let's make sure there's enough engineers. We're not getting the actual technical staff that are needed to do this. And someday it may in fact all be autonomous, but until such time, and you have a lights out, and I think we're a ways away from lights out. But I do think the development of those careers, the FANUC CERT training, I know there's a school in Garland, Texas. The students in that Garland High School come out of the FANUC CERT training and are hired at $76,000 a year.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, I mean, we hear stories all the time about that.
All day long.
Yeah.
And so I in pulling together a project team in Dallas. They were probably our best advocate for, they've got about 200 manufacturers in that region who are all just eager to have students directly out of high school. And having worked with the Dallas County Manufacturers Association on an apprentice program several years back, I know that General Dynamics there said, I'll take a kid from Garland High School and we will, we'll pay for their education. So without question, there's a lot of support from the employer base, but it really is about connecting students into really the technical skills. So when you ask what's the gap, it's a technical capability. And even some of the technical colleges that are here have some of their largest student bases are engineers.
Yeah. It's interesting how many engineers go back to a technical school to get that hands-on education. We have, Bernie, we've had an incredible conversation. I feel like we could talk forever about workforce development, about emerging technologies, automation, all of these things. We've got about 1 minute left. And so, we love asking all of our guests this. You've had so much life experience. You've done amazing things. You've had so many projects. I mean, hearing your stories is really, really neat. And I would ask you the same question we ask every guest on the Tech Ed podcast. If you could give one piece of advice to a high school sophomore as they consider their future, what would that be?
Well, I always believe do what you love.
Yeah.
But we're going to live in an automated world, so learn how to love automation.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. We hear a lot, do what you love, do what you're passionate about, but combine that with automation. Love it. Bernie Lynch, the CEO of Factory Unlocked, has been our guest on the Tech Ed podcast here at Automation Fair. Bernie, thank you so much for participating in this with us.
Thank you, Melissa.